Paul Amahara hung back in the shadows, careful not to draw any unwanted attention to himself. Not yet anyway. His impassive eyes scanned the vast amphitheater chamber, taking in the hundreds of alien delegates that represented nearly every known sentient civilization. What an absolute worthless mess, he thought to himself as he witnessed the fruitless bickering and heated arguments erupting across the assembled council. Dozens of holographic translation pits flickered with a constant chaotic buzz as ambassadors and dignitaries voiced their grievances in turn. At the hub of the raucous maelstrom sat the centrist coalition delegation, the whole reason this summit had been called into emergency session in the first place. A cadre of bronzed, elaborately robed alien behemoth, their smug, condescending aspects reminded Paul of every entitled, arrogant upper class he had ever wanted to put a bullet between their eyes. These nutjobs just sat there completely disinterested, undisguised sneers of contempt on their flat faces as they calmly rebuffed every plea and threat launched their way, as if the other alien race's indignation over their actions was the whinging of mere insects buzzing for attention. With a snort, Paul reflected on the data reports that had been comprehensively compiled about this supremacist power block from the core systems. The centrists, what an arrogant moniker. As if they thought they were at the absolute center of importance for the entire damn galaxy. From what Paul could gather through the constant stream of translation filters filling his cybernetically implanted earpiece, it seemed the centrists had decided to go on a good old-fashioned genocidal campaign of enslavement and outright extermination. Rounding up undesirable populations, glassing entire worlds over the slightest provocations or insults to their pretentious values and sensibilities. Nice little ethnic cleansing blitzkrieg those special kinds of psychos got going on, Paul noted with dry detachment. From the sheer desperation echoing across the alien delegates, more than a few races had already been completely wiped out across dozens of star systems, thanks to the centrist rampage. Yet for every demand and threat leveled at them, the centrists simply sat back, looking completely unamused and disinterested, quietly assured of their unshakable dominance. Sure, a few of the louder, more militant alien factions howled about gathering a military offensive massive enough to potentially grind the centrists down, but everyone with any sense of pragmatic tactics could see that was nothing but woefully hollow bravado. From everything Paul's mission briefings had downloaded, the centrists had assembled a mind-numbingly vast naval armada of incalculable destructive capacity, more than enough firepower to smash any conventional oppositions into atomized shards of pulverized rocks and radiation. Which, if his own internal calculations were correct, likely meant all these blowhards and appeasers were completely screwed in that regard. The centrists had mobilized for a total war of annihilation that wouldn't stop until every last undesirable alien civilization was well and properly rendered into a smoldering mass grave. With a subtle glance over his shoulder into the shadow-draped recesses of the amphitheater's entrance lobby, Paul made a silent check-in with his new employers. The brief glimpses of furtive motion and the slight twitches of his cochlear implant confirmed they were still holding position. At this point, all that remained was for the fireworks to start. A hush gradually fell over the raucous amphitheater as the diminutive form of Ambassador Zonich de Rilithin made its way towards the central podium. The wizened old Richie ambassador stood barely 2 feet tall, its overlarge black eyes blinking owlishly from the depths of its threadbare robes. Rickies. Now there was a species that knew how to keep their damn fool thoughts to themselves when the situation called for discretion. From his shadowy observation point, Paul studied the unassuming little aliens carefully. Most galactic civilizations probably dismissed the timid furballs as cosmic irrelevancies, weird anthropomorphic pack rodents more interested in their ritualistic chanting and spiritual contemplation rather than trifling affairs of warfare and conquest. But of course that was precisely why Paul's superiors had decided to selectively reveal humanity's existence to the Rickies instead of any of the more belligerent, expansionist species roaming the stars. When the humans had first made that shocking intro several decades ago, they had insisted on the utmost secrecy from their new counterparts. No sense announcing themselves to a wider galactic community until they were certain they could defend themselves from any potential threats. And the pacifist Rickies had been only too eager to oblige, treating the existence of humans as tantamount to sacred knowledge to be safeguarded at all costs. which was why Paul found himself fascinated to see how the Ritchie ambassador was now behaving with such uncharacteristic audacity in the face of a full intergalactic summit. Squaring its tiny shoulders, Zon-H-Rilithin began to speak in a stridently amplified voice that immediately cut through the ambient noise. Noble beings, esteemed diplomats and warriors. Species of virtue across this gathered fraternity of worlds, the Ritchie announced in a curious alien tongue that Paul's implants smoothly translated. I come before you all on this dire epoch, bearing news of immense gravity and portent. In the shadowed movements flickering Paul's peripheral vision, he could sense his human compatriots tensing in readiness. The Ritchie had indeed reached the point of no return. There would be no aborting or de-escalating this confrontation, not after such an ominous preamble. The centrist ambassadors stirred with visible disinterest, their hulking armored forms adopting dismissive postures of contempt for whatever triviality the insignificant Ritchie had to convey. Over the innumerous cycles of our humble race's spiritual journey through this universe, Zon-H-Rilithin continued, the tinny amplification of its voice reverberating with ceremonial gravity, we have borne witness to the rise and transcendence of civilizations, and the brutal, scouring obliteration of those deemed unworthy by the capricious tides of entropy. A murmur of confusion rippled across the assembled delegates and dignitaries. Clearly, few could fathom what revelatory truth the reclusive Ritchie order could possibly have obtained that would be so monumentally profound in scope. Paul, meanwhile, maintained his icy vigil from the shadows, close enough to easily track the widening stance and repositioning of the centrist security forces ringing the podium. If things turned in an overtly confrontational direction, he was poised to deal with it with all the brutality that he could muster. And amongst all these tumultuous celestial occurrences spanning the ages, Zon-H-Rilithin suddenly thundered with barely restrained intensity that we Ritchie have borne witness to the awakening of a doom unto creation itself, a force of such implacable hostility and preternatural aggression that all other belligerent powers throughout the cosmos would prove but as ripples against its indelible tsunami. Okay. Now even Paul had to admit. That little fuzzball just got his full undivided attention. A shocked silence hung over the amphitheater like the vacuum of space itself as the Ritchie ambassador seemed to regain its breath. The security forces gathered on high alert, undoubtedly prepared for an attack or bombing of some kind. Because there was no mistaking the severity of what the tiny alien race was now ominously implying. So heed my words, rampaging scions of the centrist collective Zon-H-Rilithin bellowed out in solemn proclamation. For if you insist on prolonging your malicious genocidal crusade against all free beings of virtue and consciousness. Paul tensed as every human operative present transmitted identical neural codes to his tactical implants. This was it then. The do-or-die moment had arrived. Then we Ritchie shall have no choice, the ambassador intoned with apocalyptic finality, but to unleash upon you the human reavers. What happened next was as sudden and surreal as a nightmare becoming terribly manifest. In one coordinated singularity of motion, Paul and his fellow human warriors stepped from the shadows silently, sublimely, like a collective apparition manifesting into being. Overhead, the amplified speakers shrilled with the discharge of plasma rifles from a dozen other concealed emplacements, as still more humans revealed their positions. However, none of those hidden positions were in this meeting room, they were elsewhere. The speakers working as a wonderful overture of doom that warned all who could hear it just what sort of threat humans posed to them. At least that was the intention. Paul had yet to see if shock and awe would be enough to stave off what horrors would be coming next. But it was Paul who strode forward towards the central podium in full view of the shocked alien assemblage, a look of indifferent menace scoured into his weathered face. With each dull thudding footstep, the human warrior exuded a preternatural aura of threat and violence that seemed to physically oppress the grandiosely gilded amphitheater. One by one, he marked the delegations of the gathered alien species with his cold, remorseless eyes, judging them, sizing them up, as if calculating how most efficiently to exterminate their various civilizations. Until finally his biomechanically enhanced vision fixed on the centrist diplomats with irresistible and focused intensity. The collective intake of terrified breaths from the assembled aliens was as audible as a black hole swallowing matter and energy from the universe. game recognizing game, hunter scenting prey. This was indeed no mere idle threat, however cataclysmic the Ritchie's proclamations had been. What spirit of brutality is this? One of the centrist emissaries finally hissed in something approximating shock, the first hints of preternatural fear seeping through its facade of dismissive arrogance. Ambassador Zonich the Rilithan drew itself up to its full unassuming height. This is the wrath of the human species. A race of such implacable violence and aggression, they make even the vilest centrist ambitions pale by contrast. Paul never broke his wintry stare across the utterly transfixed and horrified alien delegates. All he gave was a single fractional nod, the simple human gesture already conveying a terrifying tsunami of promised devastation against the centrist forces. This single specimen was but a vanguard, an omen harbinger of incalculable greater savagery to come, because when humanity declared its campaign of retribution, it would not relent until every last centrist warship and soldiers had been burned away into atomic cinders scattered across the void. No pleas would be heeded, no terms for quarter accepted. The centrists had awoken and provoked the full primal fury of human military response. And now the reckoning would come. All of it. A profound silence gripped the amphitheater chamber, as if all the accumulated breath had been violently sucked from its atmospheric envelope. Paul kept his implacable stare leveled at the now visibly shaken centrist delegation, letting the moment stretch out into an icy infinity of dread. Finally, one of the towering armored emissaries gathered enough composure to speak, its booming voice shattering the vacuum stillness like a physical slap to the senses. This is the cataclysmic force you believe can be unleashed against us, Ritchie filth. The centrist's words dripped with a mix of residual contempt and newly sown trepidation. Its gestalt appendages swept a dismissive arc towards Paul. A single warrior. Organism, it demanded incredulously. One of the primate savages that still clings to the irradiated ruins of its womb world. Paul felt the subtle neural trigger codes pulsing through his tactical cybernetic implants. Translating the myriad of alien languages being spoken, he easily followed every boast and bravado hurled his way by the suddenly loquacious centrist diplomats. They seemed to be compensating for the first waves of uncertainty crashing against their hubris fortifications, puffing up their feathered chests, haranguing him with all manner of blistering xenophobic insults on humanity's martial prowess. All of it the sound and fury signifying nothing to Paul, no more offensive or impactful than having raw sewage splashed into his face. He'd heard it all before, and far worse, during the most grueling combat certifications of his prior military career. And is this brutish human specimen your vaunted new breed of warrior? Chancellor, a different centrist delegate practically sneered, talons fully unleashed as it turned on the shrunken Ritchie ambassador. Because if this is the apex ravener you hope to unloose against our forces of celestial might, then your entire race is forfeit to a more expedient extermination. It punctuated its bravado with a gout of thick spittle splattering across the chamber floor. Zonich the Rilithan made no reply, nor movement to acknowledge the overt display of intimidation. The tiny Ritchie simply folded its paws within folds of robe and stood impassively. For in truth, no words were necessary at this juncture. Only the human warrior's introduction and revelatory presence was required to drive home the full gravity of what the centrists now potentially faced. And as Paul tracked the mounting physical symptoms of disquiet and anxiety rippling through the centrist delegation's demeanor, he knew their feeble bravado was simply a last facade of denial about to crumble. So he gave them one final immutable push over the edge into the yawning chasm of inescapable truth. Without any telegraphed motion or preamble, Paul spoke, his voice a soft, deceptively conversational murmur that somehow filled the entire amphitheater with a clarity of dreadful purpose. Not so long ago, my human ancestors roamed the irradiated deathscapes and radioactive ash plains of a world we had turned into one massive open-air abattoir, having killed every other living thing foolish enough to share its ill-fated continents alongside our rapacious omnicidal expansion. The human warrior's tone remained effectless, clinical in its precision. Yet the visceral images his words conjured punctuated each syllable with skin-crawling horror. Paul noticed one of the centrists physically recoiling behind its rearmost security phalanx. We extinguished anything and everything that dared impede our entropic consumption of resources, committed acts of mass industrial slaughter on a planetary scale against our enemies, until only humans reigned supreme over those radioactive, corpse-littered deserts we had massacred into being. And then, when we had finally attained that long-coveted absolute dominion across our cradle world, do you know what we did next? The silence was so palpable it became a throbbing auditory weight pressing upon all those gathered, as if even the grand cosmic mechanics of the universe itself had ground to an expectant halt. We looked to the stars and prepared ourselves for our next orgy of genocidal conquest, for that is what we humans do. Centrist emperors we kill, exterminate, and destroy until nothing is left for us to vent our caustic rage against. The balefire of complete and uncompromising violence danced behind Paul's eyes as he finally raked his unflinching stare across the remainder of the alien Congress. Not a single abdicated delegate or ambassador could maintain that soul-scouring gaze for more than a fractional second. Death is our culture, atrocity, our art form, and we have become the most elite savages this galaxy has ever borne nightmares about. So consider this your only warning, centrist warmongering filth. His next words were as succinct and remorseless as a tombstone's epitaph. Renounce this fratricidal campaign you've sanctioned, or be made extinct alongside the innumerable other life forms we human reavers have burned away into the void over the eons of our insatiable bloodlust. A heartbeat throbbed in which not even residual starship drive flutters could be detected across the chamber's hyper-attenuated sensors. And then, the human vermin has been judged. Richie blasphemers, one of the centrist emissaries, practically shrieked with self-deluding vehemence. And we inviolable. Do you hear? We are the unassailable truth and dominance of. Its ranting was cut off in a deluge of brackish fluids as Paul snapped his sidearm from its holster and de-expanded the alien's cranium at a quarter of Prometheus light speed. The corpse struck the floor in a geysering splatter of biomatter mere moments before the deafening concussive report even finished crisply echoing across the amphitheater walls. Once more, Paul stood unflinchingly, a look of utterly dispassionate remorselessness set across his cragged human features as he calmly returned his plasma sidearm to its holster. Then so be it, centrists, he intoned with preternatural calm promise of genocidal inevitability. Your reckoning has been decreed. With that final declaration of irrevocable sentence, the human operator simply turned his back on the shaken alien delegate assembly and began walking away, moving with precisely measured cadence across the sound-swallowed floor of the amphitheater. As each deliberate footfall carried him back into the shadow-swallowed periphery of the chamber entrance, every single alien spectator parted from his path, as if scalded by the mere proximity of his presence. None dared utter even the faintest noise of protest, their silence now deafening in its finality of utter surrender before this unveiled messenger of humanity's uncompromising purge. In the hollows of space outside that amphitheater, a steadily building concentration of unimaginably massive human Starfleet armadas was even now responding to the silent recall vectors, converging like xeno-devouring locusts upon the centrist homeworld coordinates relayed to their aim points through unbreakable quantum encryption. No appeals, no attempts at restitution would be accepted by human command. The reckoning was nigh. And scourged from the galactic star charts, the centrist empire would soon be rendered unto the same oblivion. All other existential threats to humanity's dominance had been consigned over the epochs. Paul strode from the amphitheater's echoing depths with the same measured, unhurried cadence that had sliced through its ephemeral calm like a dreadnought's ram stabbing an icy void. Behind him, the first shock waves of primal panic and terror were already rippling across the stunned alien delegations. He paid it all no mind, the frantic shouting, the sputtering outrage, desperate pleas for sanity and restraint. To Paul, such pathetic displays of fragile alien psyches crumbling before the mere implied promises of human extremism were irrelevant background noise. The facts had been delivered, repercussions understood on a deeply atavistic level by every sapient present. There would be no preventing the cataclysmic firestorm to come now that humanity's judgment had been decreed. Within seconds of breaching the grand amphitheater's entry hall, Paul was met by the elite Ricci honor guard flanked by his fellow human combat operatives. The diminutive fur-clad aliens bowed in ceremonial reverence as he briskly approached. Well struck and executed upon the spark of revelation, Warder Imahara, the lead Ricci, chanted in a voice etched in remorseless conviction. As was foretold, the mere appearance of humanity's aspect and provenance was enough to incept the unsummered existential reaping you were deputed to deliver unto hostile forces. Paul gave a terse nod of acknowledgement, double-checking the telemetry uplinks syncing with his cybernetic implants. Everything was proceeding as the Ricci elders and human strategists had foreseen, the initial cycle of unavoidable conflict now catalyzing. "My role has been decreed as our envoy and executor of inevitability," he replied in a voice sandblasted from all superfluous compassion and mercy. The centrist ambassadors now understand with pristine clarity that they activated the beacons summoning our extinction protocol against their aggressive overreach. Already, the faint high whinnying of incoming heavy bombardment craft filled the upper ionosphere as Paul conversed, the unmistakable harbinger roar of mass accelerator cannons being brought to full operational status. Within moments, the entire amphitheater complex would become an irradiated smear on the night side of this world. Nor would it be the last such cataclysmic salvo loosed upon the centrist core territory by the swiftly descending human armadas. No, this was merely the most ceremonial of overtures, the singular clarion call of annihilationism woven into humanity's cultural DNA over the scorching epochs. The centrists sought omnipotence through xenocide, Paul continued in a voice heated from the fusion pyres of 1,000,000,000,000 human battlegrounds, and so they shall receive the full reckoning of humanity's incalculable wrath against all existential threats to our perpetuation. Without another word, he turned and swept from the now empty entry hall as its foundations began buckling beneath the leading shockwaves of orbital saturation bombardments. Behind him, the few scattered Ricci remained as silent witness, their simple security detail dismissively disregarded. Any concept of restraint or proportional response had been extinguished with the first vaporizing impact detonations, now reducing this world to cinders. All that would follow would be an unstoppable cancer of scorched orbitals, atmosphere-searing firestorms, and ecosystem biocides until nothing remained but another hollow shell of lifeless rock to mark humanity's unflinching dedication to total existential resolution. Of course, the brutalized truth was that Paul and his special warfare brethren had no compunctions, nor ethical constraints around such mass atrocities being delivered against a hostile power structure. This was simply another merciless culling of the weak and unworthy carried out by the human species against any life forms seeking uncontested galactic control. As he rapidly cycled through the various after-action uploads and new aim point contingencies being distributed from human command nexus coordinates, Paul knew this initial bombardment would be but the opening overture in humanity's full-scale purge assaulting the centrist empire on every conceivable front of existence. Bioscoured worlds rendered to radioactive ash. Economies strangled into lifeless starvation. Food and water supplies lethally corrupted with mass virulent plagues. Communication and travel nodes severed by pinpoint orbital kinetics. Civilian populations sieged into cannibalistic self-destruction through induced resource strangulation. All of it adding up to one unavoidable cultural vector for humanity, the inexorable, preternatural capacity to escalate beyond any external power's ability to comprehend or halt its terminal hostility until the complete extinction of targeted forces was achieved. And throughout this process, Paul and his fellow warders would stalk amidst the horrific zones of carnage, surgical instruments of the highest human resolve, ensuring not a single aperture remained unsealed nor life form left to regenerate a future challenge to their species' agenda. As he wordlessly boarded the armored human shuttle and felt its fusion drives ignite to propel them far beyond the melting shockwaves of destruction now consuming this world, Paul reflected on the countless civilizations across the millennia who had dared provoke humanity's scorched gauntlet in such wanton miscomprehension. They invariably made the same mistakes, viewing humans as crude, visceral creatures shackled by irrational impulses and biological limitations. Right up until those first genocidal atrocities began cascading through their worlds, populations in very cultural existence, suddenly unveiling the full reality of humanity's agenda through an endgame crucible. Humanity itself had been forged and hardwired to endure across the eons. Unfortunately for the centrists, their vaulted ambitions and grandiose warmongering had simply activated a code woven into humanity's apocalypsean core drive to completely and irreversibly exterminate any potential existential threats before they metastasized beyond recovery. Realigning his tactical interfaces in preparation for the next cycle of depredations, Paul couldn't help but emit something approximating a fatalistic sigh. Whether they grasped it or not, the centrists had triggered an extinction they were now helplessly trapped within. But such remorselessness was the singular path humanity had long since discovered as the only absolute insurance against its perpetual survival, no matter how many planets had to be shattered to their compacted cores in order to seal it. The human shuttle banked hard on its final outer atmospheric ascent, burning through a fading bloom of radioactive particulates before entering the pristine void separating this benighted world from the choking palls of mass destruction now rapidly engulfing its surfaces. Through armorplast viewports, Paul could make out the vast armada of human warships and englobers that had massed in a blockading web of orbital superiority, sleek predatory forms bristling with enough concentrated firepower to reduce 100 worlds to their constituent subatomic particles. Already, fresh torrents of hypervelocity ordnance were stabbing down through the increasingly diffuse cloud blankets, rupturing continents into smoldering impact craters that would consume the biospheres in spiraling regenerative shockwaves. Centrist core command and control has been effectively decapitated on this world, the shuttle's AI cortex relayed in a genderless Burr translation. With the amphitheater and primary transmitter arrays atomized, their ability to coordinate any semblance of galactic counterattack or rallied defense is now zero factor. Paul grunted in acknowledgement, already cycling through the new raft of engagement updates flooding his neurotac links. As always, humanity's opening offensive strikes had been executed to flawless precision, crippling the centrist ability to wage the protracted war they'd clearly banked on provoking. Too bad for them that was never part of humanity's game plan. "Link me with Fleet Command," he sub-vocalized over his throat implants. "I need their updated operational readouts on where our subsequent extinction waves will be focusing next." If the centrists think this introductory bombardment sphere represents any pause or inertia on our part, they clearly were too deluded to grasp what's coming. As his neural displays updated in real time, Paul reflexively processed incoming TerraCycle calculations on trillions of variables, human strategy matrices for resource denial, cultural strangulation, atmospheric immolation of whole centrist arcologies. Even with his synaptic overrides, the raw scope and inhuman scale of it all instilled a deep genetic terror in his evolved human psyche. But that was the whole point. Humanity's escalation dominance had been exquisitely honed over uncountable conflagrations, mastering not just the physical but neurological plane of warfare. To crush any adversary's resolve and crush their capacity to strategize, counterattack, or offer meaningful reprisal through sheer overwhelming application of violence across unthinkable simultaneities and vectors. Paul knew from centuries of battlefield data continuum that after the first human fleets arrived to blockade a target world and sever external defenses, the subsequent transition cycles were always the most psychically traumatizing for any arrogant enough species foolish enough to have provoked mankind down this xenocidal path. Because once the enemy grasped that the initial impact detonations were merely prelude to a mounting symphony of annihilationism, a numbing existential dread would seize their forces in civilian population centers. A vast entropic howling at humanity's unstanchable capacity to up-ramp operations beyond even their ability to fully model, let alone resist. Oh sure, there would be momentary spasms and death quivers of incoherent counter-resistance, acts of futile terror as centrist zealots tried to comprehend and unleash retaliatory strikes against human forces. Maybe even managing a few scattered body blow impacts that would have razed entire centrist continents against any other foe. But in the face of calculated, industrialized human wrath and fatalistic contingencies that had been calibrated and hardened across a billion seared human consciousnesses, such meager provocations were little more than ambient noise, static lost beneath humanity's tsunami of compounded, multi-generational escalations. This was, after all, the race that had once depopulated an entire spiral arm over the course of 7,000 years, simply as a strategic maneuver to deny resources to a long-forgotten foe. The civilization that had disassembled entire terrestrial planets into their constituent element groups and strewn them across local star clusters as industrialized minefield impediments. There were no limits, no red lines that humanity would not cross when its very existence was put into potential jeopardy. Having endured the apocalyptic crucibles of their own genospheres, they had become existence's most uncompromising engine. The nightmare scythe that culled away all weakened organisms, to make way for humanity's perpetual perseverance over the eons to come. As his shuttle slid into the waiting launch bay of one of the larger englobers, Paul knew that all across the embattled centrist domain, this horrifying truth would already be passing into unavoidable sentience. Every frantic report, every sensor burst of new human fleet activity would cast their extinction into starker relief. And then finally the ultimate realization would seep through every panicking centrist mind. This unstoppable human purge could only be averted through an unconditional, utter abdication of their entire culture and existence to serve humanity's agenda, or be utterly exterminated with what amounted to automated indifference at the genetic level. Upon materializing inside the Englober's command center, a crisply formal human officer greeted Paul with a salute of preternatural implication. "Warder Imahara, your strategy kernels were impeccable as always," she declared, wasting no time on superfluous pomp or pretense. "We have confirmed the centrist leadership and civilian populaces have entered preliminary shock and denial trauma waves after your exhibition with their delegates. The realization of what's coming is starting to take root." Paul gave a taciturn nod, already transmitting a new volley of command prioritizations for the next termination cyclers to execute. Good. Then have all fleets and detached contingencies tighten their noose around the primary centrist worlds and start pinching the vital resource vectors immediately. "It shall be as decreed," the officer gestured towards an auxiliary monitor bank, where a stunningly comprehensive logistical and attack matrix had already begun depicting the steadily mounting human military saturation around centrist territories. "Remember, this is just the intro cycle," Paul reminded her in a voice laser etched by battlefield contingencies. "We have only just begun applying pressure. Once their denial cracks, that's when our full resolutional capacities will commence the final extinction protocol." He paused to admire the fractal patterning and multispectrum projections of imminent destruction already suffusing the operational holograms. When the centrists finally comprehend humanity's apocalypse in all its awful grandeur, we will give them no choice but to render their entire civilization unto oblivion. And with those remorseless words, Paul knew he had sounded the death knell that would echo throughout the centrist empire until its very last flickering resource and hope had been devoured without mercy or sentiment. For that was humanity's final ultimatum to all other potentially threatening species who crossed their path. Unconditional surrender and submission, or the full cataclysmic wrath of extinction, would be unleashed against them until their very stellar dust was purged from the galaxies. Paul had read it enough times in the Xenocide lineages and ancestral battlefield archives to know this was no mere boast or hubris. It was an immutable reflection of humanity's core cultural drives that had only intensified over the blood-soaked epochs. And he would not rest until the last centrist had been made to accept that irrevocable judgment through the infinite agonies to come. The total erasure of yet another failed competitor for supremacy against humanity's relentless engines of perpetuation. I hope you enjoyed this story. If you did, please be sure to subscribe and leave it a like. It helps the channel a ton. I'll see you in the next one.